Hi, we're live. You didn't see the countdown?
I didn't get I don't have a counter on mine.
You don't have a counter?
Yeah, we don't.
Well, keep in mind, I'm on the mobile app. I'm on the mobile app, and it does not show a counter.
Right. I see. Hey, guys, that's a weird intro. So welcome to this week's Behind the Ballot. I'm your host, Jeff Waldorf, working together with, of course, Get Vocal on their platform in order to talk about issues relating to the midterms. So what we're going to talk about this week is the specter of voter fraud. And you hear from one of the major political parties that voter fraud is a gigantic issue that we are doing nothing to address, whereas the other side says that it's not voter fraud so much, but it's actually voter suppression. So we're going to look at both sides. We're going to kind of break it down. With me, of course, is my excellent panel. You've got Jordan French here with his friend joining us as well. We have Dan Spearin, and we also have freelance journalist Walter Yates. So welcome to the show. All right. So as I said before, we are discussing the issue of voter fraud in elections. So I want to peruse some of these headlines. I'll call them headlines. In some conservative publications, I chose the Daily Wire, basically talking about how Democrats lie about voter suppression and ignore voter fraud, which they claim, of course, is rampant. Now, you've heard the president talk about how there were millions of illegals that voted during the 2016 election. We haven't really seen a whole lot of evidence of that, nor have we seen a lot of evidence of voter fraud in reality. But nonetheless, I want to throw to you guys and ask you, is voter fraud is that a real problem? Jordan, let's start with you.
There were millions of illegals that voted in the 2016 election, and the president truly believed that, then by all means, we should throw out those results, and we should probably have a do-over. Obviously, he doesn't actually believe that. He's playing to the base and saying what he knows they want to hear because he knows they won't think it to a logical conclusion that the results were therefore invalid. It's just, you just have to throw out that red meat and that dog whistle. Is it really even a dog whistle at this point?
We can all hear it.
So there's the thing. Oh, sorry.
We can all hear it.
Yeah. It's maybe we're dogs. I don't know. But I guess my thing with this is there's a lot of times where the knee-jerk reaction is, oh, that's racist. Oh, that's racist. And as someone who grows up, in that part of the country, obviously here in the redder part of America, that kind of gets my dander up sometimes. I want to push back against that. But the fact of the matter is, in this particular issue, whenever it comes to voter fraud, the people who get weeded out in all these laws, without a doubt, going back to when it was overt and it was, hey, black people can't vote, and then it was poll taxes, and then it was, whatever generation you're in, with 100% of the time, there is a solid line of who it is that gets trimmed from the voter rolls whenever these types of things are passed. And so it's clear, it's not so much a dog whistle. It's a continual line of history that you can plot since, the Reconstruction and going forward. That this is not so much about carrying out justice, and this is not so much about the integrity of our voting system as it is about stopping people who look a certain way and also by proxy vote a certain way from having a voice in the system.
Walter, let's start to you. What do you think about what Jordan was saying?
Jordan, it's of all the studies I've seen, all the research I've seen on voter fraud, it has largely been seen scientifically to be a myth. There was a recent study in North Carolina that showed examples of voter fraud of people voting that were not actually registered, or about around 7 to 10 votes over a 10-year period. There's been other studies around the country. So the bigger issue is voter suppression, but a lot of Republicans don't want to speak about that. There's systems in place like cross-check, and voter purges, which happen in more blue states like New York. New York has a gigantic problem with how they run elections, especially primaries. So that's by far the bigger issue. And honestly, if Republicans wanted to score more political points, they'd be talking about voter suppression happening in states like New York and super delegates, which are now kind of lost their power after recent conversations within the Democratic Party. So the voter fraud myth it's easily disproven, and there's no science to back it up, say that it is factual.
All right, Dan, you were sitting outside of the country. You're an outsider looking in. So I just want to get your perspective on what you think about this discussion about voter fraud versus voter suppression. Just your general thoughts about it.
I think the number one thing that I really have noticed in the last 2 years of your country with politics is I think the Democrats and the left are doing a very bad job of tying Trump to the Republicans. And a couple people have spoken about this, but like, this goes back a long ways, and like, not to speak ill of the dead, but I mean, John McCain was famously on record in 2008 saying that we were on the verge for one of the greatest frauds in voter history when he was talking about Acorn, and he said it was going to destroy the fabric of your democracy. This is a racial ploy by the Republicans, and it's been one that's been consistent. You actually look at a really great piece of journalism from the Washington Post from a few years ago, where they looked at they actually interviewed a North Carolina longtime Republican strategist named Carter Wren, and Carter Wren goes on to talk about it's actually not racist because it just happened that you vote Democrat. If black folk voted Republican, their votes would have been fine. And like, that is essentially the quote. You can take a look at that. So these are the issues. It's a long time case, and the stats over and over again, different studies. Look at a law school professor, Justin, I believe, Lithias. He did one between 2000 and 2014. They found 35 credible allegations between 2000 and 2014 of voter impersonation. That's 800 million ballots. Pop culture took a look at this. The newsroom does an entire Will McAvoy rant on how this problem is racially biased and how it is trumped up in the press.
Mm-hmm. And going back to that comprehensive study in the Washington Post that you just referenced, there's actually over 1 billion ballots that were counted. So it's even less of a statistical data point that they can look at for credible cases of voter fraud. And as far as the 2016 election, you also have a review of the 2016 election found 4 documented cases of voter fraud. 4. No widespread voter fraud, no millions of so-called illegals voting, and yet Donald Trump, President Trump, and the rest of the Republican Party continue to maintain that this is an enormous problem. Looking at, again, some of the conservative articles from the Daily Wire, you have people asking, or writers asking and posting articles like, voter fraud, twice as many ballots cast as there are voters in a Georgia precinct. So they'll go and look at this and say that there were more ballots cast than people living there. There must be voter fraud, and we need to go and we need to clean up this system, and we need to implement strong voter ID laws, and we need to do continuous purges of our, voter rolls to make sure that we don't have people voting that they shouldn't be. It's an election security issue, they'll argue. So as far as all the different arguments that they use, those are some of them. And I just want to throw to you guys. Let's start back with Walter here, and what you think. Why do they continue to use these articles? Why do they continue to use these arguments when there's no actual data to back them up?
Well, I would suggest that because a lot of the arguments the Republican Party is using right now are not based in facts, and that's unfortunate. And I believe they want to have voter ID also to disenfranchise millennials and post-millennials, because a lot of the younger voters, when they move out of state, they don't have an ID within that state, and most of those are voting probably to the left of what even the establishment Democrats want them to vote for. So it's just a really poor tactic that isn't going to work. It hasn't worked thus far. Democracy is in the Constitution. People have the rights to vote, and they can keep trying to take it away, but I think it's in its last leg of having a real influence in the political process, just because the ideas coming from the Republican Party are so bad right now and they're not popular.
Okay, so I see, Jordan, you're shaking your head. Jump in.
Yeah, the reason they're still doing it is because it's working and because it hasn't reached its end game yet. It's a bad idea in the sense that it's not true and it's borderline, or not borderline, it's straight up evil. Let's keep it real. But the reason they keep doing it is because it keeps working. They are disenfranchising voters, and they are changing electoral maps, and they are limiting people who vote against them in droves. And it's not near the end. We as millennials have this kind of Pollyanna idea of, once this generation dies, then we're going to be okay. Well, first off, this generation's got 30 or 40 years left in it. Like these people are not all in their 90s. Some of these people are in their 60s and 50s. And some of these people, quite frankly, are in their 20s and 30s. Maybe not a huge number, but they're there. And this is totally working. And this is how they are able to be in a country where these policies are not popular, where the president and Congress both have, such low approval ratings, and they're still able to pass their agenda. Because all the people that object to them either don't vote, or not politically active, and haven't been mobilized by the opposition like we talked about last week, or whenever they do try to vote, in a lot of instances, they find out they've been disenfranchised over some technicality they didn't even realize was a thing by the same people, for what it's worth, that don't want you to have an idea to purchase a firearm. So, I definitely agree with what Walter says. It's a bad policy because it's a bad policy. But if you're measuring policy in terms of efficacy, it's a pretty fucking good policy.
Dan, why don't you jump in?
That we're speaking to is once we talk about this is kind of the thread for this whole voting discussion in the last few weeks, is they've marketing mutiny of politics. The end game is power. It is not politics, even in the sense of helping the electorate out. But I want to shift to one thing that I think is sort of interesting. And we talk about fake news and we talk about these things, and one of the things that's super interesting about it is a lot of it has to do with media. Fake news is like what appears to be true a lot of the times. It's almost true. This week I stopped I messaged actually quite a famous writer who had shared a Trump tweet that was a fake Trump tweet, but it was almost accurate and it looked right. This goes to the heart of these debates, right? Where the Miami mayor in like the 90s ended up with like a bunch of absentee ballots bearing the names of dead people and you've seen that in The Simpsons. There's a Simpsons episode. It's a very popular like third act primetime drama aha moment of like, we found the ballots and the ballots are fake. So we have a lot of pop culture that plays into that fear.
So I'm looking right now at one of the cases of voter fraud and going back to some of the things that you guys have mentioned about race. Notice how the one person that actually got a sentence for voter fraud is a Texas woman. She's an African-American woman, Crystal Mason, 5 years. And of course, the reason is not because she was maliciously voting, maliciously attempting to do voter fraud. It's she didn't know that she wasn't allowed to vote. And these are the cases that seem to be highlighted. And usually when it comes down to it, and we can go back to some of those, studies on voter fraud, where most of it is just, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to vote, or I didn't know that I couldn't. And I did anyway. And then suddenly, oh, look, they come after me when it comes to voter fraud, like accusing me of voter fraud. So it's in a lot of those cases, it is accidental, and yet Republicans continue to pounce on this idea that these people are doing something that's malicious and doing something obviously that they shouldn't do, but we should throw the book at them.
Hey, Jeff, I'm sorry. I just want to make sure I understood you right. Did you say like she's the only one that's been convicted, or were you saying like she was one of the in the stories that you were reading?
One of the few that were convicted.
Because another thread of this is that we see that a lot of the people who actually get caught doing this are people conservatives trying to prove voter fraud is such a problem.
Yeah, that's
and how easy it is to get away with, and then they get caught. So like do those people ever get convicted?
Very rarely, from what I've seen. And again, that's a problem that plays into themes that you have touched on. You've all talked about. There's the racism theme, and then there's oh no, I'm trying to prove that there's voter fraud by doing voter fraud, which is probably one of the most ridiculous things that you could ever come up with, but it's what they attempt to do. And again, there were 4 documented cases of voter fraud in 2016. One of them was that woman. It's crazy what what we're seeing here with not only the reaction to this, but the attempted legislation to try to put a stop to this, which brings us, of course, to voter suppression. And so we have voter suppression measures. And one of the things, too, that I want to address on that is it's not just the Republicans that are doing that now. It's in some cases, at least in primary elections, Democrats are also learning from that. And we can look to the past primaries in New York. For example, the 2016 primary in New York, where over 200,000 people were purged from the voter rolls. And then you just look at the last election in New York as well, where you had a lot of stories of people being purged from the voter rolls. So, Walter, I want to get your thoughts on that.
That's the issue. I think that is really something that isn't being talked about enough, because it literally is happening on both sides. That's why I don't think voter fraud is as working as well, because if people would show up and vote, it probably wouldn't have that big of an influence. But voter suppression and the way it was happening, there's also cases in Rhode Island of precincts being shut down because they were expected to go for Bernie Sanders, and a lot of things that happened in Arizona with just not having enough precincts open, a lot closing. So I think that's a far bigger issue with things like cross-check and purging voters that are trying to vote, or having rules that say you must register about 8 months in advance of a primary for the specific party to go to vote in the primary, and it's being used. And the excuse is that we want to make sure our primaries are legitimate and people from the other party aren't voting to sway the election. So I think that's the bigger issue, along with gerrymandering as well, that is really actually hurting democracy rather than empowering it.
Dan?
I don't disagree, but I really would like to draw a line in the sand, and maybe I'm the only one who wants to, but I would like to draw a line in the sand between party politics infighting and long-term voter suppression that's racially discriminated. Like, racial discrimination in your country goes back a really long way. Power infighting over Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton is bad, and it should be dealt with, but I don't love it in the same breath as the tactic that it just disproportionately affects black voters in your country. So I really feel like that the two conversations, though I understand if we were in a university classroom, could be held in the same conversation. I don't love it in this conversation because I just don't feel they're comparable.
Okay. Jordan?
I mean, Dan's right, and Dan's sort of not right. Like yeah, the motivations are the same, quite frankly, in that they're saying we as a party know what we want and let's do this. The difference is one of those motivations is this is what we want to accomplish as a party. We think this is who can do it. The other one of those motivations is we want to keep the status quo where white people benefit over people of color. And so the mechanism is the same. What's behind the mechanism is different. Dan's totally right. But primaries, this is what Ryan and I were just talking about on mute. Primaries are a bizarre thing in America where we have this weird hybrid of, well, they're the party's rules, and therefore, the party should get to decide, since it's their thing, but we also fund them publicly. And so they either need to be open elections, publicly funded, or the party needs to have control to close them as much as they want to and pay for them 100% out of pocket. But that's probably a different conversation for another day. And I don't want to get us too completely off topic.
I mean, it is kind of weird that they have these contests that are supposed, and again, we are getting off on a little bit of a tangent, but it is kind of strange. You have these different contests where it's closed unless you register, but then you're registered with that party, and you only do so because you can vote. But then you can vote whatever.
Well, and you have to register the way the party wants to, and it's different from state by state. And again, I'm fine with that if the party is paying for it completely.
Yeah,
but if we're going to publicly fund, I'm fine with either one of those outcomes. We just need to pick one, because right now we've got a hybrid that isn't fair to anybody.
Which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And if you have, going back to the New York example, you have some state parties that are incredibly restrictive when it comes to when you can register and when you're able to, vote in their elections. New York, it's somewhere probably about a year to 8 months or something that you have to pre-register in order to vote in a primary, which of course depresses turnout results. And after all, this is what this discussion series is all about, is examining the issues inherent in our electoral system when it comes to midterm elections. And you wonder why turnout is depressed during the midterms. There's a lot of different factors. Excitement is one of them, but also arcane voting systems is another one. And so where there's not a lot of turnout in normal midterms, there's also a less of a turnout when it comes to primaries leading up to those midterms. And those are some serious issues we need to talk about, aside from just the voter suppression.
Here's something else, though, that I'd really like to push back on, which is, you know what else makes people not vote and makes people apathetic? The idea that everything's corrupt and that the system is rigged and that there's no point in going to the ballot. And I don't love the narrative coming out of a lot of the progressive camps on the internet that everything is rigged and everything's against us, and if only it wasn't rigged, we would have won. Bernie would not have won if the system was better, because he just didn't have enough base loyalty in the Democratic Party to win that election. He did not
100% agree.
He did. And Cynthia Nixon would not have beat Cuomo in New York because Cuomo has been there and the family's in there. It takes a long time and it takes a lot of movement and it takes a lot of work and more than one election cycle to make real change. And this narrative of go pack your bags because the big guy in the suit upstairs is rigged everything for you is terrible, because in reality, you can change the system, and it doesn't take a lot of people to make change in a system where people are apathetic. So the message should be go out and make change and stick this out. And a blue wave, as I said to you before, shouldn't be a wave. It's a long-term process. It is a marathon, not a sprint. And I just really dislike this idea that like somehow we can make change in one election cycle, and if we don't, it's because something was rigged.
And that's a great point, Dan, and that's what you see with the Bernie base, right? Because what happened after the election cycle? Bernie got back in line with the party because he knew like that this is my team or whatever, and this is who I need to work with to like get whatever in my agenda I want to accomplish. And the hardcore Bernie base was like, "Oh, Bernie's a sellout." I'm like, Bernie's doing what he's done his entire career, right? Like he went into campaign mode where he barely, let's keep it real, not really didn't come down on the party all that hard. This is, I'm sick and tired of hearing about your damn emails, Bernie Sanders. Like he was pretty cordial to his opposition in the primary.
Oh, yeah.
And then because he wants to govern, he started governing after it. And the far fringes of that party were like, "Oh, what a sellout." And they turned their back on him. And it's just like, guys, you didn't get one election the way you wanted it to go. That you think you're going to affect change, like whenever it takes getting beat once for you to completely give up? Yeah, give me a break, man. Like that's not how it works.
Yeah, so I was going to push back on you a little bit, Jordan, and then you pointed out, but it's the fringe. You're absolutely right. It is the fringe, and you can argue that there's a lot of people in that fringe that were not necessarily, I wouldn't say necessarily progressive. I guess there are varying degrees. But not necessarily.
If Bernie were an area rogue,
let me finish my thought, Jordan. Hold on. Let me finish my thought here. These are not people who have been involved in politics for very long and don't understand that it takes a while for things to change.
And I think all of you make really, really good points. I guess for what Dan said, I think it's separating the internet echo chambers from what actually happens in reality, because most of Bernie Sanders supporters still voted for Hillary Clinton. That did happen.
That is more so than Hillary Clinton supporters voted for Obama.
Correct. So I think there is a problem. I've had to deal with certain individuals who think it's a great idea to say that everything is rigged and all this conversation around everything is rigged and we should just stop voting or create another third party, which would be like an eighth party at this point. And that does hurt people and those not involved in politics to go out and vote. And change is already happening. If you look at it, like what Bernie Sanders meant to the election has changed the discourse in the country. And that's an objective fact. That's already changed. We can see it with PCCC, Justice Democrats, our revolution. Like the change is happening, but there are some extremely loud voices that I'm not even sure if they're really progressive that are screaming that everything is rigged. That Bernie Sanders is like, look at his career over the past 40 years. He hasn't sold anything. He's doing the same thing, and the same people still dislike him. So he's fighting both wings. So I agree with everything everyone is saying. And there's a lot going on the left that needs to be addressed, but not a lot of people are talking about it.
Yeah, and it's not just about Bernie Sanders. Just hold on. Let me say one thing about that though. I wasn't referring to the infighting on the internet per se. I'm talking about the media echo chamber that creates the people who aren't voting at all. Right. I'm not speaking to like this is a progressive problem or a sliver of progressive. I'm saying that like on the right wing, we get a lot of media echo chamber of the government's coming for you. This is bad and everything sucks. And look at this. And on the left, though, we get like corporations own everything and you're never going to make change. And there's this like on both sides of the echo chamber is putting out a message of like, don't really get involved because it's pointless. And that's the problem, right? It's that. So like, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, there is a real problem that we can define by data that is showing that black folks in your country are getting disenfranchised by specific measures that are being put in to disenfranchise them. And at the same time, the justifications for that and those laws are, once again, by data, proven to be wrong. Whereas the other stuff is a lot of party politics. So that's what I'm going back to is like, when we talk about both of them in the same conversation, when we try to mix the two, for me, it becomes that conversation of don't get involved, don't worry about stuff. It's all rigged and it's all corrupt and it's just, go on about your day. So that was what I'm trying to say. It's not about left or right. It's about that person. It's about your electorate that can't get above like 62% voting. And what would happen if it did? And we won't get there until we see a change in that media narrative, for me.
Yeah, I'll totally concede that to you. I think I'm 100% on board with you there.
So I agree with you as well, but at some point, don't we have to be able to have deeply complex political conversations in this country without people giving up? Because I think at this point, a lot of the issues that we're facing in the United States are deeply complex, and there's a lot of misinformation being passed around that voters kind of really need to talk about. Like universal health care is one of the issues. What we're doing with tax reform and following it upwards, these are conversations we need to have. But if we try to narrow it down to small segments, from what I've seen, just with people I've spoken with, people have commented on my work, I think we're selling them short a little bit if we don't have those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to do something that's that I haven't done with you guys before, but I'm going to take an audience question. And there's somebody who's responding here to our discussion, and she asked, "What about the Electoral College?" I hear a lot of young people saying, "Why bother to vote?" Because the Electoral College is going to make the decision anyway, no matter how we vote. So I want to have you guys just go around the table and discuss that if you want. Dan, go ahead, jump in.
That's what I'm saying, right? It's like there's all of these X factors that people shrug and say, so that's why I don't participate. And the reality is you have to participate. I mean, the only way things are going to get better is as if more people that you agree with obviously get into power. So, I mean, you can just shrug and go, but I hope you're in a very privileged and cushy spot in life. And if you are, I hope you think about the people beneath your income line, because they don't have the extra time that you do to be apathetic. And I'm not saying this person who asked the question is, and I get your frustration, because the Electoral College was, once again, speaking of things that were meant to disenfranchise black folks, we obviously have that. You obviously in your history have that issue as well. But at the end of the day, I think that you have to engage in your local ridings. And I think if I could say one thing about the Electoral College is everybody thinks really big because it's really easy now. The internet gave us this ability to talk to everyone. Like I'm sitting here in Toronto and we're talking to Arkansas and Michigan, and we're always having these conversations. So yeah, and again, we're looking at these conversations, right, as big worldwide ideas, but in reality, change is kind of local. And so if you don't get involved, I know it's not as sexy, but like the way to change that, you really can make change in your backyard, and it starts from there.
Yeah, it's all about. I mean, it's all about getting involved. How are you supposed to change these systems? Unless, I mean, there's really other two options. You change it from within, or you tear it down. And it's a lot easier to make change from within than to tear the entire system down, which there are certainly some people out there that are advocating lighting fire to the entire thing. I'm not necessarily in that camp. So,
and I think I might have a little stronger opinion on that than Dan. That's a question I get a lot from people from where I'm from. Like, well, why should I vote when there's this electoral college? And I honestly think that's intellectually lazy, because were you going to vote anyway? Or are you just using this as an excuse? I know you personally. You don't really care that much about politics. You say it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect my life anyway, which is false. So I think a lot of times when people say that, it's like they're not looking deep enough into the issues. And it might affect the presidency, but what about the Senate? What about the House? What about the state elections? Like that involves one election. Do I like it? No, but that shouldn't be an excuse to not get politically involved, because if all the other elections go the way you want them, that's going to affect the presidency, and that's going to affect what legislation gets signed into law. So I really dislike that excuse more than most of any other ones to not vote.
Yeah, here's the thing too. People who decide not to vote again because the election that they voted in, their candidate lost, suck it up, guys. I mean, that's not a good excuse to not go out. The person that I voted for, or I should say the people that I voted for since Obama, like, have not won. I voted for very progressive people, let's say. And so I knew they had a long shot. I knew they didn't have a huge chance. Dr. Abdul El-Sayed, I voted for him here in Michigan. Did not win the election. Sad. But even though that some of those people that are going for the bigger positions don't win, there are some in the smaller positions that do win, going back to Dan's point of starting small. When people were talking about how, Cynthia Nixon, she didn't win against Cuomo, everything is terrible now, and Zephyr Teachout did not win the attorney general, and that position. Yeah, but did you also know in that same election, I think it was 7 IDC members got knocked out? So now Cuomo and replaced by progressives. So now Cuomo has a progressive Congress that he's going to have to explain when that Congress decides to pass Medicare for all, why he's going to not vote in favor of it, especially when he's going to be running allegedly or, for president in 2020. He's going to have to explain that. So that's a big victory. And yet people, going back to the media issue, they don't cover that stuff. And I think it's the media. Some in the media want to depress turnout for progressives, and other people thrive on, of course, saying the system is rigged. Why bother? Because they don't want you involved.
Yay is always a better headline than yay, and that's the problem with a lot of things that we have to deal with in our mainstream media. And I really think the point of things like TYT Nation, or the points of things like the Young Turks Network and various different progressive media outlets, really should be to take a hit every once in a while on your view count and do God's work and actually highlight these small little wins all the time, because the wins all the time are what really is going to keep people energized and interested. Like, so for example, even like you've had trans folk get elected for the first time ever, and I don't really see how in the press and there's not a lot of coverage on how that happened. Like, get in there and find out like how much hard work went into that, and really give us a behind the scenes take on those stories. How did those people fall in New York? You only heard about Cynthia, but guess what? And these people that are doing that, in all honesty, that's who everyone should be trying to retweet. And I did see a lot of the like bigger name, left wing online folks on Twitter really try, I think, when Cynthia lost and Nixon lost, to be kind of like, no, this is the beginning, and this campaign was amazing, and we really pushed Cuomo to the left on this, and that was a big victory. And that's what we need to keep doing, because that gets people excited about the process, and that makes people feel things aren't as hopeless. And they're not. They're really not hopeless. They're not as bad as it seems. You're just getting an affront of media at you, around you, saying like, "Oh well, this isn't great." But there's a lot of great storylines happening across the country.
Right. I mean, a good example is Christine Hellquist. She's the first trans woman to win the Vermont governor primary. So the gubernatorial primary. That's a big win. That's something that didn't get a lot of attention. That's something that people didn't really pick up on. And that's something that it's really sad to see that it's not getting the kind of attention that it's getting.
And I can speak to what Dan was talking about personally, because those articles don't get a lot of big view counts, and you can go say something where you're saying you're doing a takedown of whoever, and people want to share that like crazy. But when you interview a candidate, you talk about specific issues, those clicks are lower when you try to do objective journalism. That's why there's a lot of talking heads that play to crowds. I'll say it nicely. So yeah, and then that's true. There are, and the best thing about Cynthia Nixon's election, analyzing it, I didn't think there was probably about a 10% chance she could have actually beaten Cuomo by how that race was falling. But what happened down ballot was because Cynthia Nixon was in the race. The IDC would still be there if it was not for Cynthia Nixon. She got a lot of people to the polls that would have stayed home otherwise. And that stuff is extremely important. That's why everything the progressive groups like PCCC, Our Revolution, Justice Democrats are doing, that they are helping. I think Mia Turner said they're helping lay down the foundation for what's to come. And that is, and as a journalist that's covered elections, that is important, because this stuff doesn't change overnight. And a lot of people jumping into politics and they're like, well, I guess we give up now because we can never win. I'm like, 5 years ago, I just turned 30. 10 years ago, the talk about someone like Bernie Sanders being president was not possible. That's impossible. And what he did in 2016 is like, yeah, there definitely could be a progressive social democrat president in the United States. And I mean, just look at President Obama. His dad was from Africa. He was president. Like, things change, but they're not going to change overnight. You have to keep going and not fall into traps of, well, let's just burn the whole thing down, let's just kill a Democratic Party, because that's just going to end up being Republicans with how far right there. If you want to still say it's right, they're going to take over and keep all legislation for the next 20 years. And I don't think that's an America that those individuals want to see.
Right. And of course, there is still that old issue of voter suppression as well, tactics by Republicans that certainly is in their favor to kind of bring it all back around. And we've seen all those different iterations, interstate cross-check, as you mentioned. And of course, you had races where it seemed a little curious why the results came out the way that they did. There's a Kansas race, for example, with Chris Kobach that had some irregularities. And so, look, electoral fraud is something that we should also talk about in the greater context of things, and voter suppression. But I think we all agree as an issue, and all the studies agree as an issue, that voter fraud, basically fake news. So, guys, I want to get your final thoughts on everything, and we'll go around the table if you want to, give your last thoughts here. Jordan, real quick, what's your takeaway? Okay. So we'll go with Jordan, you're muted. Just a real quick takeaway. Okay. I don't know.
Jordan's just doing a tableau for us to tell you what happens when your voice is silent.
Sorry. So, yeah, that's a great take, Dan. Yeah, no, like the keyboard popped up. I'm on the phone. It was the whole thing. So I noticed you left the two white guys in the South out of the electoral college question. So I'm trying to go ahead, and that'll be my final thought, is to weigh in on that and to say that states have a vested interest in elections, including in executive branch elections. However, and this is where the abolish the Electoral College or defend the Electoral College people don't acknowledge reality, is at the time the Electoral College was established, there was an appropriate distribution that matched population. Since then, we have passed legislation that limits the number of electoral votes that states have. So a state like California that has, I want to say it's either high 50s or into the lower triple digits. I forget exactly what their electoral college vote is. If it matched the number that came with the electoral college in its inception, would have like 2,000 electoral votes. And so if we want to keep the institution because of the purposes it serves, then we need to go back to that and keep it in the way that actually matches the population of a state, so that we don't have states in the middle of the country that, where their votes literally count more than other votes. And with that, I'll cede the rest of my time to Ryan.
Yeah, well, one thing I was going to add in, touching on something you were discussing earlier about voter disaffection, is one thing I really encourage people locally to do is get on the campaign staff or volunteer rather with local candidates that you may know or support. A lot of these national issues, we can talk about them, but they really are kind of beyond our purview to control or affect in a direct way. I mean, it's just far above our pay grade beyond, voting, contacting your congressperson, et cetera, every 2 to 4 years. But if you are feeling disaffected in terms of the political process, find a local candidate and really work for them. And it helps you learn about, how the actual gears and levers work. And it helps you feel a lot more hopeful about the system.
And that's true in this issue especially, right? Because these are all state and local laws. Yep. These are not federal voter disenfranchisement laws. They're all happening at the state level. Yeah. So get involved with the guys in your backyard, because that's where this change happens.
Mm-hmm. All right. Walter, final thoughts, last words?
My final thoughts are I do think these are important, where people can go around and talk without there being shouting and trying to speak over each other. And that's how change does happen. That's how ideas are improved upon and how things are bettered. And that's not something happening a lot from any medium. And we need more of that, especially when it comes to issues like what is factual and what is false. So I definitely appreciate a meeting like this, and I do agree that even the Electoral College has a bit of nuance to it, because candidates would never go to, say, Iowa without it. They would spend their time in California, New York, and Florida, or Texas for the most part. So I think there's conversation not about everything, and that we definitely need to make sure our democracy is intact and stop voter suppression and the limited voter fraud that is basically a myth.
All right, Dan?
Do it all over the map, let's just go back to the percentage of voter fraud is so small that it's inconsequential. We've talked about studies. There was like 35 total credible allegations between 2000 and 2014. Jeff brought up a Washington Post article that speaks to how small that actual problem is. And you can go to like people like Carter Wren, who spent years in North Carolina as a Republican strategist, flat out telling you that this is about voter suppression and the excuse is voter fraud. So pushing that out of the way, I think that one of the things that we can do is, as everyone else has said, get engaged. But I'll leave you with this thought. If anybody watches sports, you always see a documentary about the winning team or the person who won the race. And you know what you see first? That time they didn't win the race, or that time that they lost the previous championship, but they came together and they figured out that's what we need to win. Now we know how to lose, so now we know how to win. You never see that in politics and government, but it's the same thing. You have to go through the gauntlet before you can come out the other side of it. This is a marathon, not a sprint. I'm Dan Spearin. Over to America.
All right, guys. That's it for the stream. I want to thank you guys for watching here. And want to remind you, if you want to get into the conversation, you can go to getvocal.com and sign up and go and go into these conversations and, have conversations with other like-minded people, or sometimes not like-minded people, and try to keep it civil. So thank you all for watching. We'll be back with another one next Monday. We'll be talking about Russia. Are they coming for our elections? That's next week. So we'll see you then. And remember, guys, get vocal.